Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. Today is October the 13th, 2016, and you're listening to Episode 3. Politicoast is the podcast that explores what is happening in British Columbia and around the country.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or wherever you found this podcast, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticoastPod. Alright, so I want to start today with some of the feedback we got over the past week. And I want to preface that by saying we did run a small Facebook ad campaign with the link to our last episode to just try to get, a bit more attention to it. Of course, our last episode was all about carbon pricing, and so we put a picture of Justin Trudeau announcing his carbon pricing plan in the House of Commons as a cover photo. It seemed appropriate, and that seems to be what hit the Facebook shit fan. But before we get into the terrible side, and all those other deplorables, and segue into more talk about deplorable people, let's look at some of the more constructive feedback we got. You had some thoughts on that, Scott?
Yes. I put up a blog post detailing some of the responses we got, kind of my take on how they measure up as arguments against carbon pricing. However, there were a few broad categories discussed. First of all, we got claims carbon prices don't work, and paired with that is the claim that BC emissions have increased since the tax was introduced in 2008. The economic theory behind it's pretty straightforward. People respond to incentives. Those incentives mean people will reduce the more marginal uses where they gain the least benefit from the carbon they emit, and that'll drive down prices overall. Doesn't necessarily happen all at once, but people, may buy a more fuel-efficient car, just gas is a little more pricey, or buy a product that has a less intensive production cycle. And the second point about emissions, per the BC government's data, emissions of CO2 2008 were 66.8 megatons, and they've dropped to 64.5. So there has been a decrease. The second point raised, and this is one that's been a favorite of the federal conservatives in the House, is that this is going to impact the poor, the middle class, and raise the cost of living. And while that's definitely a concern, if they follow a BC model where it's revenue neutral, all the money collected gets refunded through tax cuts and rebates targeted in low-income households, the net effect can be basically zero if you live a low-to-average carbon-intensive lifestyle. And over the long run, it's going to incentivize less costly lifestyles, and that'll decrease costs in the long run for people. And finally, there's the argument that generally corporations, not people, should be bearing the cost of climate change and the damage that incurs. However, there's two basic problems with that. One is that ultimately people are the main drivers of the demand. And if nobody wanted to buy oil to use, there'd be no Exxon, none of those big companies to make money by selling us those pollutant fuels. So people therefore should have to pay for the cost their consumption inflicts on the environment, and also costs will get passed on to the consumers anyway. It's just a tax, but a hidden tax rather than an explicit one. We also got a comment on Twitter asking about whether carbon taxes are really that effective, or should we be focusing on stopping the fossil fuel expansion. For that, I'm not sure how Ian feels on this one, but at least in my point of view, there's going to be some trade-offs with fossil fuels. Obviously, the costs are, we're going to have pollution, climate change, but we do get some benefits out of them. We get energy, and it's really useful for small portable applications where you can't haul a solar panel around or any of that stuff. Airplanes and similar uses, which just aren't renewable compatible at this moment, as well as it's a feedstock for a lot of useful products, plastics, chemicals, pharmaceuticals. So there's a trade-off we have to balance going forward. And the good thing about carbon tax is they have us evaluate the costs on an ongoing basis of each of those trade-offs, and then we have to evaluate whether the additional cost is worth the benefits we get.
On that point, one of the things I know that is coming, or is supposedly coming, from the federal government is more than just the price. Because what the criticism we talked about last week was that this price isn't high enough if it stands by itself. But supposedly there's additional measures coming from the federal government, regulations, those kind of things that will push the dirtier fossil fuels out of operation. The sort of dirty coal and things that a lot of the country relies on, and try to incentivize more green energies. At least that's what I hope. But, of course, in the seemingly standard Trudeau Liberal fashion, we're not getting those announcements yet. Maybe he's just waiting for the next climate conference to put all the ministers in a room so he can just tell them what they're deciding. Again, maybe that's the strategy he's going for.
Yeah, well, if the Conservatives are smart going forward, they'd be really hammering home the point of going to carbon pricing rather than these sort of regulatory measures. But right now they seem to be too stuck on taxes are bad rather than how to best harness markets, which should be their primary focus going forward.
For sure. So that was the sort of useful, helpful even feedback. We like the constructive criticism, the things that make us think and help us better construct our ideas. But then there was this whole, and frankly it was the majority of the comments we got, at least on Facebook, visceral backlash that ranged from the sort of less articulate versions of those critiques to people who just wanted to throw insults at Trudeau for the sake of it. And I'm not going to waste time here repeating any of that, although I will say I think we've somewhat arrived at a moderation policy because of this, which is that if you come to our page and leave a pile of feces with no substance, we're going to delete your shitty comment. And if you spout your conspiracy theories, I'm just going to mock you with aliens. But what these comments do expose for me is that there is this absurdly partisan anti-Trudeau undercurrent and mentality out there in Canadian society. And I think it's more than just that. It's this sort of utter toxic and xenophobic mindset. And you see that in one or two of the comments that tried to link Trudeau's attempt to bring in a carbon price with his love of refugees and bringing them in as though there's any connection with that at all. And, you know, it's a similar toxic xenophobic mindset that fueled Brexit to some extent. It fuels Trump down south. And we're naive if we try to pretend that doesn't exist in Canada, I think.
Oh, I think it definitely does exist. I'm just not convinced that this is a particularly exceptional degree of vitriol we're seeing right now in Canada. It's unfortunately just been a reality of our politics for a long time. Just in the last decade, it was more generally focused towards the incumbent party who happened to be on the right, rather than where it is now, where it's generally focused leftward at the Trudeau government. But, I mean, the term Harper derangement syndrome was thrown about quite a bit and was coined for a reason, because there were quite a few comments and criticisms of him that went well beyond what his actual failings were as a prime minister into the more absurd vitriolic stuff. I mean, there's the infamous Soldiers on Our Streets ad from the 2006 campaign. And as late as 2011, I remember hearing about how Harper was going to usher in a Christian theocracy in Canada, which, well, 5 years later is noticeably absent. I mean, there's just enough about the man to criticize without having to invent reasons. But that didn't stop people from doing so.
Yeah, I mean, I get your point. And there are some of those things that if you go back through my online written record, which is substantial and vast, and if you Google me, I'm the only Ian Bushfield out there, and I've said strong things about Harper, but I don't think I ever just went onto a Facebook page and went, fuck Harper. And I like to think that most of what I saw wasn't that. There was that, I guess. And maybe you're right. Maybe I just want to hope that we can foster a slightly better dialogue and discussion. And so I'm going to keep up with deleting the shitty comments if they come by.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think the trend line overall is going in the wrong direction, but I'm just not convinced that the comments we saw would have been out of place 5-6 years ago.
Maybe it's just my bias. I'm more afraid of the alt-right than I am of, like, pot-smoking commies.
Yeah, fair enough.
Well, with that discussion, let's delve in to the other deplorables, that is, the state of the U.S. presidential election. We both watched the debate over the weekend, and I laid out some of my thoughts in a blog that I put up on Monday morning, right after I watched the debate. And I held off writing that blog, and I held off watching that debate because I made the smart decision to focus my Sunday on watching the Blue Jays finish their sweep of Texas in the ALDS. So my thoughts are there for everyone to read at politicos.ca. But what were your thoughts, Scott?
Well, it's been said before, but I think it bears repeating that Trump is remarkable in just how far outside the normal substantive and respectable political discourse, well, such as it is, and just how much of an outlier 2016's election has been. I mean, for any other politician, this would have been a massive loss. It would have absolutely torpedoed his campaign down to probably single digits. But listening to the pundits pontificate on it, it came out as a losing but okay performance,
Whereas in the first debate, he tripped over the bar that was sitting on the ground for him to step over. And in this one, he kicked it a little but managed to get past.
Yeah, after the first half hour or so.
When he wasn't threatening people with jail time or, disagreeing with his running mate on substantive policy issues.
Yeah, and I think it's worth dwelling on for a moment just how outside of the normal political discourse that is. There's no effective, responsible democracy results in jailing of political opponents. Presidents, for a long time, have erred on the side of caution on that, letting arguably very serious transgressions slide just to avoid so much as the appearance of politically motivated prosecutions.
You saw Gerald Ford pardon Richard Nixon.
And Obama in 2008 declined to pursue what were probably very justifiable prosecutions on torture issues from the Bush administration.
So it's worrying, as Trump's entire campaign has been, but it's the sort of authoritarian, autocratic tendencies put on display in an even more visual and obvious way. You can see people on the same political side disagree subtly with each other. You'll see within the NDP, the provincial and federal parties take subtly different lines on, say, pipeline and resource extraction. But you don't usually see them go, oh, we don't talk and I disagree. It was just so fast and clear. It was nice to get an honest answer from a politician, I guess. But you'd kind of hope that he was talking to his running mate. At least if I were his strategist or, people behind the scenes.
Yes, and what happened with Pence and what was revealed how they're apparently not even talking about where the campaign's positions are and stuff. For those who didn't watch the debate, Trump laid out a position of favoring working with Assad in Syria, and the moderators questioned him on Pence's previous comments where he took a hard line against Assad and advocated for measures to reduce Assad's influence and Assad's ability to conduct operations against the civilians of Syria.
Potentially even including military force in Syria
it was,
against the Russians. And
I believe the term forceful was used to describe his position on that. But Trump's response was, we haven't talked about it, and I don't agree. And that's definitely a very odd thing to hear in a presidential debate. I mean, it was one of those things that would probably sink any other campaign. And it indicates that Pence and probably most of the other advisors he has aren't really going to be moderating influence on a Trump administration.
Moderating is an interesting word for Pence, who is a pretty... I guess he's the more traditional Republican who's anti-choice, anti-civil rights, anti-everything the liberal side of me is. He's just not as authoritarian, I guess, as Trump, or as populist in it.
And it's just kind of sad commentary on where 2016 is that Pence is considered a moderating influence.
I mean, the other problem, of course, is, and I put this in my blog post, the Trump's sort of breaking from that bipartisan foreign policy standard that both parties have sort of agreed to in the U.S., where the Republicans and Democrats have sort of the same policy. It's just how hawkish versus diplomatic they are about it. Neither of them is going to start a war with Russia, but they're not going to become best friends either. They're going to get involved in things like Syria, but the question is how involved and how many troops, and those kind of things is the policy differences and what other angles they're going to take. Trump is just sort of breaking far from that, and not in a clear way. It's just sort of, he wants to tackle, I guess it is a clear way. He wants to tackle ISIS.
Yes.
ISIS.
Well, that's the thing. He demonstrated a absurdly simplistic view of what the Syria conflict is, and, well, geopolitics in general. As far as I can tell, his thought process is ISIS is bad, anybody fighting ISIS must be good as a result. And that's the sort of lack of nuance that would not suit a president well.
You do see him take these positions that seem to favor the Russian government, and then you also have these stories about him picking up the WikiLeaks press as though it's almost fed to him from the Russian propaganda arm. There was a story in Newsweek where a journalist pointed out a false story was put in a Russian propaganda arm, and then that got picked up by the Trump campaign. So that's not saying that it's necessarily Putin on the phone with Trump saying, run this. It might just be his campaign is so blinded by hatred of Hillary that they'll pick up obvious propaganda to use if they think they can get a half a point out of it.
Yes, and I think this is definitely concerning, this closeness with Russia in Trump's stances. And Russia's definitely, in the last couple of years, shown an increasingly expansionist tendency and seems keen, or at least aimed in the general direction of reigniting the Cold War almost. They're busy hacking US and allied computers, both in the government and kind of pseudo-government positions, major political parties who effectively are part of the government in a sense. And just this week, Russia moved nuclear-capable missiles into Kaliningrad, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with Russian geography, is this little enclave that's not actually connected to the rest of Russia on the Baltic coast, squished in between Poland and the Baltic states. And this is basically Russia's forwardmost position in Europe.
And it's worrying. I lived in the UK for a couple of years, and that was during the Ukraine crisis, and you have to wonder how many more advances can Putin get away with, but then again, how do you challenge that? Like, we don't want to engage him because you don't want to start World War III openly on the battlefield, but at some point, you gotta do something.
Well, right now, NATO's response generally has been a troop buildup in the eastern NATO countries. We have a small force deployed to the Baltics right now, which, I mean, I'd have to check this, but I believe it's a company plus size deployment. So effectively nothing in the grand scheme of things, but as a rather core NATO member, it becomes a giant press here to start World War III button that we are hopefully using to scare off the Russians, because nobody wants to press that button.
We're getting close to the end of 2016, so maybe we can get out of this hellish failure of a year, and 2017 will be better.
One can only hope.
And speaking of better, what the fuck was up with this Ken Boone thing? This craze happened, and I didn't get it.
Yeah, I watched the debate too, and I honestly don't get the response either. It's,
as far as I could tell, it's just that his adorableness and his red sweater and his attempt to swing a train wreck Trumpster fire of a debate back to the edge of policy just sort of captured people. Yeah, and they went, we want him.
The two segments that Ken Boone's segment started off with were definitely the high watermarks of an otherwise dismal debate. But at the same time, I'm still at a loss for his sudden popularity. But perhaps one of our listeners could enlighten us on this.
Send us all your best Ken Boone memes. So in the last week, it hasn't gotten better for Trump. I mean, 538 now has Hillary with, I think I saw an 86% chance, or even more, depending on which polls or Polls Plus you look at, chance of winning the election. So we're sort of, it seems to be headed towards rock bottom for Trump, and there's musings about obscure Utah Mormons who could steal the presidency in a tie, but that seems unlikely if Hillary's going to just sweep the Electoral College. And a big chunk of this trend is sort of following up on his sexual assault comments. And since then, we've seen woman after woman come forward with specific stories about specific actions Trump did that constitute sexual harassment, sexual assault. For example, Trump walking in on naked women during Miss Universe pageants, just saying he owns the place, so that's what he gets to do. 2 women came out publicly in the New York Times talking about him kissing and groping them without consent, and talking about how shaken up they were. Trump denied it all, and now he's gone on this tirade of the media isn't treating him fairly.
Which is kind of ironic, considering the media really didn't look into this stuff all through the primaries, and then into the first half of the general. It's only in the last month or so they've actually really started digging into the Trump past.
So what I ended my blog post with was this theory that Hillary knows what she's doing, and her team knows what they're doing, and this is part of their strategy.
It's the classic October surprise.
Exactly. It's just, they've built up this huge fundraising lead. They can now use that to blanket the airwaves with positive Hillary's got this messages. They can also bring out all the stories that they've been collecting, because why would they give those out in August when they can give them out 3 weeks before the election and watch the Republican Party burn itself to the ground? And even if they don't know every story that's going to come out because people come forward or journalists get intrepid, they have the staff there and they have the campaign war room to respond faster and smarter than Trump.
Yes, but the real question for me in all this is, where was the Republicans' opposition research during the primary? Why didn't a Kasich staff member or the Rubio campaign or the Cruz campaign find this? Why did it take till October for this to come out? I mean, these were tapes that should have been reasonably available.
It was just locker room talk, so they didn't care. Everyone knew Trump was a bombast, and I guess no one actually expected him to win, right? They thought at some point Ben Carson would take it, or Jeb Bush would take it, or Marco Rubio would take it, or
But when we got into March and you started having people drop off and Trump was in the lead, somebody should have started digging then.
Maybe their problems are a little deeper than just running an election campaign. With the Democrats having such a huge lead in the ground game and the fight to get people out to the polls, even the advanced polls already, and this growing lead in the nationwide polls, the question's starting to become whether the Democrats can take back both houses of Congress and the White House and just really consolidate power.
Well, at this point, they're definitely leading in the presidency and the Senate races, and they'll almost certainly win both. The House, on the other hand, that's probably only going to happen in an absolute blowout for the Republicans, where they just get absolutely crushed, because there's a lot of safe seats out there. The districts are all gerrymandered, and most of the projections I've seen show Republicans losing ground there, but still retaining control.
Yeah, the last time this happened was when Obama won in 2008, and he got criticized because he started with a very conciliatory, bipartisan attempt to reach across the aisle and build consensus, and meanwhile was facing the Tea Party, who had none of it and wanted to be obstructionist, and so he got criticized for not taking advantage of that, and he ended up losing that majority. So the question is, will Hillary piss it away again?
I'm going to guess no on that. She's a much more experienced and arguably shrewder politician, and she also experienced those early Obama years and saw the lack of progress that got made when they had every opportunity to. So she's probably going to be less focused on bipartisanship and more focused on pushing her key policies through Congress and the Senate.
Let's hope so.
Yes, but it does bring up other questions. What's going to happen in the aftermath of this election? The GOP is set for a fairly decisive loss, and there's going to be a lot of reputational damage among many of the big-name Republicans. Are they going to be able to recover, and who's going to be set up to try and challenge Clinton in 2020?
It's a tough question. One of the people who's ironically kept himself farthest from Trump is Mike Pence. The VP, who should be right there, has actually got Trump on record saying they don't agree, which might be a huge advantage for any Republicans with eyes for bigger things.
Yes, in the VP debate, he basically spent most of the time setting himself up for the 2020 run and building the Mike Pence brand rather than defending Donald Trump.
That's definitely scary from my point of view and anyone who supports women's rights, I think.
And yeah, the other two names that pop to mind are Kasich and Romney. Romney had thought about running in this race, try and get a second shot at the White House, but declined to. But he's been against Trump since day one, never endorsed him, steadfastly opposed as all these scandals came out. So he's both well-liked in Republican circles and has a very clear not Trump brand he can build on for 2020. And Kasich, similar thing, never endorsed Trump when everyone else was, held out against him in the primaries even after it was well past the point where he could, in theory, win. And as a more moderate Republican, he's probably well positioned for a 2020 run.
Yeah. The worst the Republicans ever really did in modern electoral history was the Goldwater election of hyper-racism, and Americans thankfully rejecting that. And so hopefully this time we'll see a massive rejection of Trump's sort of modern version of that. But in the following elections, the Republicans did win. They did do a lot better. And they did it by sort of pivoting back to their establishment, only to eventually swing off to the Reagan side years later, which has now become the establishment. So I don't know.
We'll have to see going forward. Speaking of leadership races, the Conservatives have their first casualty in their leadership race. Tony Clement announced Wednesday he was dropping out of the leadership race.
Which is very thankful, because otherwise their debate next month would have turned into a Republican-style 15-person on the stage. It's probably still going to be pretty big.
Yes, not everyone's got their nomination papers in who've announced yet. We'll see how many made the cutoff for that debate. Yes, Clement's out. However, we did see some recent polling come out. This was before Clement dropped out, so he's still in there and was in fact in second place with 9% of the general population and 14% of Conservatives supported him.
Is there just a big unknown? Like, do people just not know how they want to vote?
Yes.
If they had that vote, they don't have a preference, essentially. They don't know who these people are.
Yes, that's correct. Most people responded with they'd prefer somebody else than the list of names running.
I don't want any of these fools.
Yeah. Part of that, I think, is just a lot of the more minor candidates just haven't built their brand and really haven't come out and built up that public name recognition.
I am waiting for a lot more Conservatives to come out.
So you have people like Scheer and Chon and Trost who aren't exactly household names for most people, and they haven't done a huge amount of press so far. And once the debate hits off and more policies get rolled out going forward, it'll probably be more well known, and I imagine the poll numbers will increase.
The debate will definitely help.
Yes, and the leader, Bernier, has been at the forefront of pushing out policy after policy, and he's gotten the most press as a result, so it's not surprising to see him at the top with 14% of the general populace and 17% of Conservatives supporting him.
It's really tough to poll leadership races. The Conservative race is one member, one vote, but it's a very weighted one member, one vote, where each riding is given 100 points. So if you are the only Conservative in a riding, you have a lot more say than, say, Calgary Southwest, where there's probably 20,000 Conservatives.
Yes, it's definitely not an easy one to model, and the membership numbers are small enough. It's hard to get a good sample of them in any poll. So at this point, it's only really a vague look, and right now if you want to look at support, probably the fundraising numbers would be a better place to look.
But that's exactly why Clement left. Well, not officially.
Yes, Clement had a rather dismal quarter in his fundraiser. It raised approximately $12,000.
Which is less than he got for his gazebo.
Yes.
That's not my joke. I stole that from CBC or Twitter. And so he got 12,000.
See, he got 12,000. Others were pulling in. Bernier claims over 100,000. Michael Chong got approximately 83,000, I believe. Okay. So when you put those up against 12,000, it was easy to see why Clement felt it was going to be a very uphill struggle for him to gain ground on those candidates.
There are times not the charm for Tony Clement.
We mentioned the leadership debate will be happening November 9th. We'll probably see a better idea of where the candidates stand afterwards.
And for all we can say about the size and challenges for the Conservative leadership race, they have a leadership race. We're still waiting for a new Democrat who wants to take that party.
Well, I'm sure a lot of Conservatives would love to have someone take Frost off their hands for them.
I can't see him going that way. Next up, Uber's eyeing moving into the BC market. We're one of the few places on Earth that hasn't been disrupted due to a combination of regulations and restrictions in this province.
Well, I don't really think that's it. Uber's shown no hesitancy to break into markets where there are a lot of regulations and restrictions on effectively operating a taxi. What's more likely is they see there's a potential compromise they can reach ahead of time with the government, and they'd rather take that approach than trying to elbow their way in and disrupt things.
Speaking of elbowing, that's exactly what Airbnb has definitely done in Vancouver. It's not really a new story, but I've definitely seen in the last couple of weeks more and more ads, either on YouTube or on TV, advertising how great Airbnb owners are in Metro Vancouver. Just in case you're maybe thinking about supporting a politician who wants to bring in regulations.
Yeah, well, with a lot of people stretched to make the mortgage payments on the overvalued Vancouver real estate they own, a lot of people are turning to Airbnb to help make up that gap. So there is definitely a constituency there of people who would support Airbnb-friendly policies.
Yeah, it's something to keep an eye on. Uber's meeting with government officials, in the past week, and there's sort of hesitancy. The government hasn't said they're going to definitely push forward anything, but they're keeping their options open. This is actually something I know the Green Party of BC has really taken up. They want to really push forward the sharing economy and use that as their sort of modernization of BC platform. And it's an interesting one because you sort of sometimes think as the Greens as being very left and very big government, but this is, I think, one place where they are trying to take a different approach.
Yes, the Greens definitely get painted as rather left, but they're actually fairly centrist in a lot of their economic policy, minus, of course, their environmental stances where that intersects with their economic policy. But they're generally fairly pro-market with regulation, and so it's not surprising to see them embrace the sharing economy.
So it'll be interesting to watch.
The federal Liberal government announced they're planning to invest in Bombardier, bring up to $54 million in funds for a Bombardier-led aerospace research consortium. But this does raise some questions. Why is the government, yet again, bailing out a business that can't make profit? If there's not a business case for Bombardier going forward, why is the government subsidizing it?
There's always multiple ways to look at it. There's the sort of argument that there's not really a jurisdiction on Earth where the free market has been that successful in the aerospace industry. It generally requires a lot of economic lubricant to
On
get
the
going.
other hand, if the U.S. taxpayer wants to pay for me to have cheaper airplanes, let them.
Well, and that brings us to the other half of the argument, which is the aerospace industry. I guess it's sort of a two-pronged argument. The aerospace industry does promote the sort of innovation and that kind of economy that the government is talking a lot about, but it also supports a big constituency of it, which is Quebec. I mean, these factories are in Ontario and Quebec where there are a lot of Liberal votes, and to some extent it could be seen crassly as just a vote-buying scheme.
Yes, and there's always been a criticism of the Liberal Party that they're focused on Ontario and Quebec and haven't been that supportive of other regions of the country. And I think this will definitely play into that narrative. I've, over the past year, seen a lot of people in the West complain that money has gone to help Bombardier, help GM, though this was under the previous government, where now that the oil sector's having trouble, there isn't money coming to help them. And I think that'll be an undercurrent that'll go forward. And I'm not sure if we're going to get to a Western alienation 2.0, but the risk is there.
Especially when you have Brad Wall calling every single thing Justin Trudeau does a tax on Saskatchewan and Saskatchewan residents. I think Trudeau's got a bit better relationship with Rachel Notley and Christy Clark, so he's got political capital and political support out here, even if they have their subtle disagreements about approach. And that probably helps to soften some of the blow, so that if Trudeau does announce $54 million to Bombardier out east, he's at least can talk about the pipelines he's inevitably going to approve and the LNG plants he's just approving. The other big local story this week around Metro Vancouver has been just the utter traffic chaos around the opening of Tsawwassen Mills. And that in itself is not really a political story. In my mind, it's just hilariously poor urban planning kind of story. But what's interesting about this is one of the first major projects of the Tsawwassen First Nations developments.
For those who aren't familiar with Metro Vancouver, Tsawwassen and the associated First Nations located nearby is a community on the southwest corner of the area. It tends to be on the more rural side, a lot of farmland in the area, and about a half hour outside of Vancouver if you're driving.
It's what you drive through when you go to the ferry. That's what it's mostly known for, is the ferry terminals there, and you can connect to Point Roberts if you want to go to that.
And they've just built this massive mall, basically in a sea of farmland right near the ferry terminal.
So Tsawwassen Mills is actually done by the same company that built Cross Iron Mills that was built in Balzac, Alberta, right where I grew up, which is just on the north edge of Calgary. And it's the same kind of colossal monument of capitalism, in a way. It has Bass Pro Shops, all these other big department stores, and it's a huge indoor mall of something you wouldn't really expect in the sort of Metro Vancouver urban walkable environment. But the developers of this mall decided to work closely with the band, and a lot of the profit of it goes to support the First Nations development, and it goes to support their social programs. So there are a lot of positives there. And so it's been described by the local chiefs as reconciliation in action. It's them sort of taking control of their own political decisions, deciding this is worthwhile for them because they will get these economic spin-offs, even if it causes traffic chaos for Metro Vancouver shoppers.
Yeah, that's definitely a positive story. I'm not completely sold on the business case of this massive mall and all the associated expenses so far in the periphery of the metro area. But it's this sort of economic development, and there's an associated housing development going in nearby as well. I believe going to have 7,000 residents approximately. It's going to be a potential point if they ever expand the Canada line southwards towards the ferry. It'll probably be a stop.
That'll be a long expansion.
There's no plans at the moment. I just want to make clear, but this is a potential 20 years down the road area to expand into. And it's these sort of economic developments that I think will be quite beneficial to see replicated elsewhere in a lot of First Nations communities.
Yeah, it's tough for me. I definitely like the ideas of the spin-offs, but it in some ways seems like a sort of short-term win for the band. They'll get a lot of money right away and in the next couple of years, but this doesn't really play into a good growth strategy for the rest of the region. And to some extent, they're totally within their right to say, fuck you, white men, because they've been so hard done by for so long. But I worry, like, it's not a transit-accessible mall. It's not a very central facility. And
yeah, it's definitely business questions about the business case for it.
And I imagine there's local opposition. There are a lot of people who don't like Bass Pro Shops specifically because it is the outdoor hunting and killing things kind of store you go to.
This is also Vancouver. There's opposition to every development.
Yes. So it'll be interesting to watch going forward. We've seen lots of opinions come out on this already, and lots of complaints and mocking of the terrible parking lot situation, which happened in Balzac when they built the mall there too, and it calmed down after a few years after the excitement wore off. And that mall is still doing well.
The big news out of Europe for Canada right now is that the CETA, which is the Comprehensive and Economic Trade Agreement, basically a free trade agreement between Canada and the European Union, just cleared a German constitutional court which just rejected a legal challenge brought by activists. Ruled it can go ahead. However, there's still some provisions that have to be approved by the German Parliament as well. The European economic ministers have yet to give their final approval, but this is definitely a step in the right direction towards approving the deal.
These things are always controversial. I mean, there's a lot of activists and environmentalists and labor groups that worry about these, and I think a lot of that comes from just the secrecy that's necessary to sign a giant agreement. Europe's done better on these type of things because of the European Parliament and the very strong NGOs in the country. It's one of the benefits. So I'm less personally worried about the sort of finer details of CETA than I am of TPP, which we can get into at some point. But CETA's still a big question mark. I know there's definitely advantages. Canada would be well served to expand trade with Europe to make us less dependent on the United States. And a lot of European countries could do well to reach out to Canada.
Yes, this eliminates 98% of tariffs between Canada and the EU. So there's definitely a lot of potential there in terms of freeing up trade and diversifying trade outside of just the cross-border trade with the US.
That's the questions that always remain on the table for me, is just how these agreements tend to prioritize those tariffs, and removing them, obviously, is the point of it. But where's the sort of simultaneous support for consumers after NAFTA? And one of the reasons there's a lot of bitterness is the average person didn't see the direct effects. There was a bit of trickle down, but if I order something from the States, I still have to pay duties. There's these like personal effects, and
cross-border shopping isn't one of those areas I think they've done particularly well in the past with on these but overall these have definitely led to reduced prices for consumer goods, which has benefited Canadians. And it's one of those things where the costs are always very apparent. A factory closes, but a general decrease in the cost of goods, food, that's harder to see and less noticeable. But overall, there are net benefits, even if there are some concentrated costs to a lot of these free trade deals.
And the other question here, of course, will be what Brexit means for all of this. I know there's a lot of talk within the British political class that they will honor an agreement and they want to be able to be a part of this. But leaving the EU means they now have to enter as a separate party into these agreements. And
yes,
maybe that's easy to do. Maybe it's an entirely different agreement.
And Britain's been one of the stronger advocates for free trade. So with their dropping to zero influence in the EU, it's going to be one less voice pushing for approval of this.
We'll keep our eye on it.
News out of Vancouver regarding the housing situation. BMO just released a report stating that the average sales price in Vancouver plunged 19% from July to August, and that's down 7.5% from a year earlier. However, the benchmark price for the city shows houses are still rising overall, and that this is primarily driven by detached housing and a drop there. This is likely in response to the foreign buyers tax that was put in place earlier this year, and we're still seeing the effects of it shake out. This early data, first month after the housing tax was put in place, and markets tend to not deal with uncertainty and sudden change as well.
Just look at Brexit.
Yeah, so we haven't reached the new normal yet, so it's hard to say from this data where it's going to go.
I was looking at graphs earlier today, and it seems like on a lot of the markets, the condos in East Burnaby, they're down a bit, but other prices are, flat. It looks like there's a lot of prices that are just flat month over month, which is different than the last, say, 24 months in Vancouver where everything's been jumping every month. So I'm not worried having just put a down payment on a house a few months ago, but I'm definitely keeping my eye on it.
Yes, and it's worth noting that this only brings us down to last year in terms of prices, which were still generally sky high and unaffordable to most people. So even if this cuts out the last year's gain, there's still issues to be addressed in the housing market.
Yeah, the hope wasn't, I think, to cut the foreign money out and drop prices. It was to because that would destroy a lot of people's equity and wealth. It was to more flatten it off, and I'm optimistic that it's flattening off, but maybe it's too early to tell.
Yeah, without addressing the supply problem, we're not really going to see much long-term change towards affordable housing in the city.
For sure. 2 more campaigns have kicked off in the last week, and I'll just mention them briefly because I know very little about either of these politics, and I think you know just slightly even less than that. The Yukon territory has launched its election campaign. The Yukon Party has been in power for about 14 years, but is supposedly rather unpopular. The Yukon Party is the sort of center-right party, the Conservative Party of the Yukon. The other parties that are the main challengers are the NDP and Liberals. There is also the Greens, but they're not running a full slate. It's not really clear right now who's going to be the next premier in a month, which is ironic because they're voting almost at the same day as the Americans, and they only have to deal with their election for a month or 4 weeks.
Lucky them.
There's not many polls out of the Yukon, so we don't actually have a good sense. The NDP is the official opposition right now in Yukon, but it could go any of 3 ways. The federal Liberals took the Yukon single seat with a very healthy majority in the last election, but it's hard to say if that will translate to territorial politics. I strongly suggest you listen to Eric Grenier's podcast this week where he speaks to someone much more in tune with Yukon politics than I am. The other news I heard is the mayoral campaign for Sechelt on the Sunshine Coast has also kicked off, even though they're 2 years away from their municipal election, so they're now facing a American-style, but on the Sunshine Coast, so it'll be really laid back, I imagine, kind of election campaign, which started in a rather hilarious way. I guess one councillor had said she was going to run for the BC Liberals in the upcoming provincial election, but then decided to not do that. She withdrew her name and announced a bid for the mayorship of Sechelt. Only she did this during a council meeting with the mayor sitting 2 or 3 seats beside her. So this will be an interesting time in the Sunshine Coast. And I'd strongly recommend, if you care at all about Sunshine Coast politics and news, checking out the Coast Reporters podcast because they do a really good job. And if there are more podcasts like that covering BC, we probably wouldn't have to do this, but we might still, just for fun.
And that has been Politicoast. Make sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticoastPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. Thanks for listening.